Welcome to Compound Insights, a podcast by CFA Society New York. I'm your host, Rob Rowan. Today we're talking about a very important change in everyone's firms, and that is around social and other types of funding issues. Today we're speaking with Bob Danhauser. He is a senior advisor with Shift, which is a nonprofit organization that works with businesses to create and implement plans with respect to people's dignities. CFA New York members may know Bob from his last gig running the private wealth management team at CFA Institute. He also had a career in asset management before that. Thank you for being here, Bob.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to be back.
So, Bob, I want to start with and just play a little bit on your company name. There is a big shift going on as people have begun to look at businesses as part of social change. How does the work that you do land at companies in general?
Sure. So we're organized as a mission-oriented nonprofit organization. So we come to this with a kind of a decidedly non-commercial bent, but we're really focused on helping businesses and financial institutions, including investors, as well as standard setters, think through what it means to do business with respect for people's rights. And that's increasingly the focus of ESG investors and people who are concerned about sustainability generally. The pandemic was all sorts of awful, but it had the positive effect of really focusing a lot more attention and sensitivity towards what happens to people as a result of business activities. And we're here to help with that.
Yeah, that is an exceptionally interesting, perhaps other podcast topic I've thought about a little bit was what COVID wrought from a cultural perspective and how that relates to investing, which is kind of what we're talking about here today.
Still being written, I think. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Could be an annual series.
Yeah. So speaking of that, how does the work that you do actually relate to investing or at a financial services firm?
So financial institutions, and let's say investors in particular, have a really powerful incentivizing role. They have the ear of companies. Companies have bottom line interests in keeping investors happy. And so to the extent that investors are interested in respecting rights, as they should, they can bring that influence or leverage to the companies that they have in their portfolios to be sure that they're also paying attention to risks to people. And that can be for very sort of selfish financial reasons. There's a lot of crossover between risks to people and risk to enterprise value, but it doesn't always have to be that way. The environment is changing. People are much, much more aware of the potential for business to have adverse impacts on people, as well as all the positive things that business does for people in their lives. You're seeing it in regulation and legislation. As these things go, it's tending to happen more in Europe first. But companies that do business in Europe are going to be subject to those same kinds of regulations. So lots of good business reasons for paying attention to this over and above just the fundamental reason that a lot of investors, banks, other financial institutions don't necessarily want to make their money by visiting harm on people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it is interesting how a lot of the ESG regulations started in Europe, started from the top and rolled down. It seems like in the US, it started from the bottom and went up. It started with people, and now regulators are getting in the game. And for a long time, ESG in the US was mostly G, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't, that trend now seems to be shifting to the S, which is where Shift is, right? So do you think that is how most investors are viewing it also in this shift towards the G?
I think we're still a little early in the game. So there's a number of progressive investors who recognize the importance of S and who are putting, in many cases, world-class efforts around trying to understand and analyze the social performance of their investees. A lot more investors, I think, are beginning to wake up to the importance of S, largely as a consequence of their investment in paying attention to E. So as I think about climate change mitigation and transition strategies, that stuff is not going to happen easily or well without paying attention to the impacts on people. So inevitably, business models are changing, capital flows are changing. People feel that. And if that's not accounted for, it's just not going to happen. We see that in a lot of the political debate here in the States as well as in Europe, where it creates instability that ultimately affects financial systems, economic systems, political systems that are what make returns possible in the first place.
It makes planning very difficult. I assume this is a place where your company comes in too. It must make planning very difficult. How do you advise people on sort of the interplay between the E and the S? And long-term planning in such a changing space?
So we urge people to take something a little bit different than what a lot of people have done up till now, which is to take a very topical focus. So you see people addressing social issues and saying, well, today I'm going to worry about diversity, and next month I'm going to worry about occupational health and safety, or maybe modern slavery issues. All terrific issues, no doubt. But we think a more systematic, strategic approach is what's called for, particularly when these issues begin to bleed over onto each other. So as social concerns become more and more relevant to the success of climate mitigation strategies. And there's a model for that. There are international standards for respect. In our case, we're particularly expert in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. But alongside them is the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises that set forth a very pragmatic, flexible approach to managing those potential impacts and actual impacts by constructing a due diligence process. Due diligence, obviously, very, very familiar to those of us in the financial world. It's got a slightly different context here, but a lot of it is the same. It's going looking for issues, trying to identify risks and assess those risks, and then developing strategies to bring leverage or influence to bear to make sure that those risks are either prevented or mitigated if they've already happened.
Okay, and this is sort of the bottom line of this podcast. Is often it's called Compound Insights because I believe in time series, and so does everyone who's listening to this. So, most CFAs rely on quantitative data. I'm really interested in how your firm approaches all of those things you just mentioned, those structures you just mentioned. How do you apply quantitative data to those, or can you?
You can. I think that's the first instinct of a lot of investors. We love our spreadsheets. We love being able to do analysis at scale. So to the extent that we can reduce risk exposure or some characteristic of how we're mitigating a risk to a single number, that's really attractive. That's hard to do for any kind of risk, but particularly for social risks where there's so much texture that goes into it. And so what you see is generally a combination of both qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis. So you're looking at the quality of how management approaches these issues. What's the robustness of their risk identification system? Very similar to what you do if you're looking at an enterprise risk system to see how are they protecting enterprise value against the multitude of risks. Again, the difference here is we're just applying this risk to people lens rather than risk to enterprise value. There are ways of getting at some pretty good descriptive statistics that do lend themselves to quantification. So thinking about a company's workforce and trying to dimension diversity, for example. So a lot of companies are already reporting gender and racial diversity at the board level. You're seeing some of the more progressive companies doing that amongst their entire workforce and trying to get at some of the essential differences that reflect how they're being treated. So, for example, differences in compensation, differences in mobility across different roles, the ability across certain groups to take advantage of opportunities as they're presented to give a better sense for whether rights are being respected. And so it's really, it's not all that much different than a classic investment strategy, which is I'm going to think qualitatively about the issues that deserve that kind of analysis, and I'm going to bolster that with quantitative analysis where it makes sense. I think that's where we're heading with the S in ESG.
Okay. And, this is another question that nags at me sometimes too, is we do a lot of work with asset owners here at CFA Society New York, and one of the difficulties they have is on the due diligence over their global asset allocation. And one of them has told quite a funny story about from the podium about one of the shocking things she found out about what one of their subs was doing when she went on vacation to an emerging market and saw a commercial for it in her hotel room and thought, oh, why do I know that name? So what do you think? What do you anticipate is coming within measuring due diligence, et cetera? The S for asset owners or for people who are, don't have fiduciary obligation, but total fiduciary obligation, but are making recommendations to clients?
Well, to do all of that, there's just a real hunger for data that's not quite being satisfied or addressed effectively yet. I think it's fashionable to beat up on data providers to say, how could you not provide us what we're looking for? But in fairness to them, I think investors and others who demand that sort of data haven't sent the most coherent signals back to the data providers to say this is the kind of thing that we really need, because people are still feeling their way. It hasn't really settled on established practice to any meaningful stance beyond that framework of the international standards that I referred to. And so there's a need for better data. The good news, I think, is that we're seeing a turn by the international standard setters. So some coherence about just who gets to decide what the standards are with the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board a year or two ago. the rendering of the European sustainability standards just in the last year or so. That's sort of centralizing the decision-making authority and the decision-making process around what corporate disclosure will look like around E, S, and G. But for our interests, we're particularly interested as they embark on thinking about S more specifically. And I think that's good news for investors who are standing to get better quality and more consistent data. It's also good news, I think, for corporate reporters. So the companies who are just drowning in data requests right now that begin to look a little random or a little bit esoteric, and it costs time and money, and there's a certain amount of reputation that goes with their publishing any kind of data. The ability to be more standardized will be helpful to them as well.
Interesting. And do you think the due diligence on investments vis-a-vis the S is where it should be too? Either in terms of skills, number of people doing it, anything? Do you think there's evolution there?
It's the very beginning of the story. So it's interesting as I talk to investors that you find that even on sustainability teams, the analytic talent that's required to look at S issues is very much nascent. People are just not used to thinking about this in really serious terms. S has been the province of values-based investors or impact investors that tended to have looked not so much at the negative implications of business activities, but always looking for the positive activities. And that's terrific, but it's really only telling half the story. And in fact, removing some of the negative impacts of business activities can go a lot or a long ways towards improving the lot of people who are affected by those activities. The folks who can put that into context, who can think through the issues, are a bit in short supply in our industry. You're seeing a lot of people making the move from non-governmental organizations over to the investment world. It's interesting that they still tend to be pretty siloed. So there's a sustainability sleeve that's often very separate from the investment team. And within the sustainability team, there's a lonely group of S people who are just getting started and building up the resources that they need. All that said, this isn't rocket science. It's about thinking about what harms are potentially or actually happening with people as a result of what business is doing, and then thinking through strategies for reducing those harms. So it's not impossible. It's really just a question of putting a little bit more time and effort against those issues.
Yeah, it's made me think a little bit about people who work at faith-based organizations, which have been a little out front of this. Here's your time to shine, folks.
Indeed. And you see, the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility here in New York just does a terrific job of showcasing practice. So, sort of walking the walk as well as talking the talk, but also opening up to mainstream investors ideas and resources that can be helpful to them. But this has definitely gone way beyond just faith-based investors. This is everybody's concern now. It's a systemic issue at its heart. And again, I think the pandemic has done a nice job of opening people's eyes to that the fact that we're externalizing some of these costs and laying onto vulnerable populations costs that can't be easily borne and very, very human costs beyond financial costs introduces an element of instability to the system that's just bad news for any investor. And, that's something that I think financial institutions are grappling with a lot more seriously now.
Yeah. And that instability is also just part of change, which all investment management firms have to abide. It's not, if it's not this change, it'll be another one next time.
I think that's right. I think it's interesting though, that the change that I see amongst investor attitudes was, 5, 6, 7 years ago, a lot of investors would say S is for the really kind of squishy people in our business who are trying to be responsive to their customers' interests in these issues, but there's really nothing there for me as an investor because it's hard for me to draw the line between bottom line results for my portfolio and these issues. And the conversations I hear now are much more about, hey, this stuff actually is pretty important. And beyond just my comfort with deriving bottom line deliverable results for my clients, I want to be doing that in a way that's respectful of rights. Partially because I think it's the right thing to do, but partially because I think that's best in the long term for the health of all these systems that we depend on for investing. So it's taken a more mainstream turn, and I think it's taking a more serious turn in terms of what people are thinking about as they think about how to analyze these issues.
Great. I can't think of a better place to leave it than there. That is a great message. Thank you, Bob. That's wonderful.
My pleasure, Rob. It's great to be here.
And thank you all for listening. Our next podcast will be a very interesting look into the Bank of Japan. We have a very senior delegate from the Bank of Japan coming to New York, and he's going to be joining us on our next podcast in 1 week's time. Until then, I'm Rob Rowan, and I've been your host of Compound Insights.